All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a story that has literally haunted and fascinated the world for nearly a century. All Quiet on the Western Front. We are going to trace its incredible journey, starting from the harrowing real-life trenches of World War I, all the way to the pages of an international bestseller, and finally to the BAFTA and Oscar-winning 2022 film adaptation. It's a heavy, massive, and absolutely crucial topic, so let's break it all down together in this explainer.
But right off the bat, I have a question I really want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. The 2022 Netflix adaptation is undeniably a visual masterpiece, right? It's stunning, visceral, terrifying. But does this modern, highly explosive film actually miss the quiet, profound, psychological horror that the original author intended? Well, to answer that, we've got to go straight back to the source.
Section 1. The Soldier Behind the Words. Uncovering the real Erich Maria Remarque.
To really understand the art, we have to understand the artist. The muddy, bloody, totally visceral imagery of the trenches wasn't just some creative writing exercise. It was a real soldier's lived experience. Erich Paul Remarque was conscripted into the Imperial German Army in 1916. He was just 18 years old. By June of 1917, he was transferred straight into the trenches of the Western Front. And then, literally just weeks later, on July 31st, his time on the front line abruptly ended when he was hit by shell shrapnel in his leg, arm, and neck. He was evacuated to a military hospital to recover. So his actual time in direct combat was incredibly brief, roughly 6 weeks. But those weeks gave him the clinical, matter-of-fact horrors that provided the searing material for his iconic writing. While he was recovering, he even gathered stories from his fellow wounded soldiers to add to it.
The crucial thing here is how Remarque channeled all that massive mental trauma. When he finally published his defining novel in 1929, he poured all of his grief into the fictional character of 17-year-old Paul Bulmer. Remarque completely avoided romanticizing the battle. There are absolutely zero grand heroes here. Instead, he used a highly restrained, almost clinical tone. He just described the violence and death with matter-of-fact precision from the perspective of an ordinary soldier. And by doing that, he gave a voice to silent, traumatized veterans who came back home and simply couldn't talk about what they'd seen.
Moving on to Section 2. The Nazi Backlash. The political reaction to an anti-war masterpiece. When this book dropped, it was a total cultural earthquake. 2 million. That is how many copies All Quiet on the Western Front sold in just its first 18 months in print. 2 million. It was an instant, phenomenal success, translated into over 26 languages. It actually inspired a brand new literary genre of veterans writing about conflict. For the first time, people who hadn't fought in the war had a rare, first-hand account of its absolute horrors. But as you might guess, not everyone was celebrating this massive success. As right-wing groups rose to power in Germany, the political climate shifted drastically. The Nazi Party was pushing a highly romanticized, heroic narrative of war, depicting battle as this glorious adventure for the fatherland. So they viewed Remarque's grim, unheroic depiction as a direct threat. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels flat out declared the writing unpatriotic. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, this book was one of the very first to be publicly banned and burned. They claimed Remarque wasn't a true German, and in 1938 they officially stripped him of his German citizenship. He was forced to live as a refugee in Switzerland and later the US.
And the real-world stakes of this political censorship are just devastating. Remarque had managed to escape, but his youngest sister, Elfriede Schultz, had stayed behind in Germany. In 1943, she was arrested and tried by the so-called People's Court for undermining morale just because she said she considered the war lost. The court president, Roland Freisler, delivered this absolutely chilling quote to her: "Your brother is unfortunately beyond our reach. You, however, will not escape us." Tragically, Elfriede was beheaded in December 1943. Remarque had absolutely no idea about her fate until after the war, and he later dedicated his 1952 novel, Spark of Life, to her memory.
Section 3. Adapting the horror. Bringing the reality of the trenches to the silver screen.
Taking this sobering anti-war reality to the big screen has pretty much always been a massive challenge. Back in 1930, Hollywood director Louis Milestone created the very first major film adaptation. It was a groundbreaking piece of cinema, actually winning 2 Oscars. But the reception over in Germany? Pure chaos. Goebbels organized these incredibly aggressive and frankly bizarre protests to disrupt the screenings. Right-wing groups literally released live mice into the dark movie theaters. They threw stink bombs into the crowds. They exerted so much political pressure that the film was heavily censored and then ultimately banned altogether in Germany. They absolutely refused to let the real cruelty of war be shown to the public.
Which brings us to Section 4, Critiquing the Modern Film, analyzing the 2022 Netflix adaptation.
Let's fast forward to the present day and look at the 2022 Netflix adaptation directed by Edward Berger. This is the film that swept modern awards ceremonies, taking home BAFTAs and Oscars. Now, the modern filmmaker had a very noble stated goal here, to completely prevent war from looking like an exciting adventure. Every single detail, the grimy mud, the cramped trenches, the unnerving, discordant music, was designed to be brutal. They aimed for equal opportunity violence, meaning the death of an enemy is shown to be just as appalling as the death of a friend. The whole intent was that after watching this, absolutely no one in the audience would ever want to go to war.
But that begs the question, how historically accurate is it really? Well, military historian Dr. Jonathan Boff from the University of Birmingham offers a fascinating breakdown. The film gets a lot right about the late 1918 setting, like the extreme youth of the soldiers, the terrible hunger from broken supply chains, the mass desertions, and the absolutely terrifying introduction of tank warfare. But Dr. Boff also points out where it misses the mark. The movie shows combat as these blind bayonet charges backwards and forwards across no man's land, right into machine guns. That's how the war was fought back in 1915. By 1918, armies had completely evolved their tactics to avoid just throwing human flesh against steel like that. So the film ends up sensationalizing the combat with big Hollywood-style explosions at the expense of real historical tactical accuracy.
And this actually leads us to the biggest critique of all, which you can see crystal clear when you compare the endings. In the 2022 film, our main character Paul dies in this highly dramatic, totally fictional final assault, ordered by a mad general literally minutes before the 11 a.m. ceasefire. But in Remarque's original book, there is no grand final battle. The book's ending is incredibly quiet. Hence the title, right? The core message of the novel is that Paul's physical death doesn't even really matter because his soul had already been completely destroyed by the war long before that final moment.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is this concept of psychological death. Think of it as the absolute alienation from civilian life and the total loss of the will to live. In the book, after Paul's mentor and closest friend Kat dies, Paul just loses whatever will to survive he had left. Critics argue that by getting so caught up in the spectacular visual whizzes and bangs of Hollywood special effects, the modern film totally misses this quiet tragedy. The sheer physical horror overwhelms the psychological point Remarque was desperately trying to make, that whether a soldier physically survived the shelling or not, their life was fundamentally devastated.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. As our cinematic technology gets better and better at showing the fiery, bloody spectacle of combat, we really have to stop and ask ourselves, in our quest to visually recreate the explosive horror of war, are we actually drowning out the quiet, devastating truth of the soldiers who fought it? Does the spectacle inherently defeat the anti-war message? It's a heavy question for sure, but one we absolutely need to consider the next time we sit down to watch a historical epic. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive provided a brand new lens through which to view both Remarque's powerful novel and the modern adaptations it continues to inspire.